Shakhan. I am the managing attorney here at Shakhan and Wilkerson Law Firm. And again, we thank you for joining us for another video. Today's video is another great one. Of course, if you are going through a divorce, there's something in Georgia that many people are familiar with. Most people know it as alimony, but it can also be called spousal support or spousal maintenance. And so that's what we'll be discussing today. But before we get to that, just a quick disclaimer. This is for educational purposes only. By watching this video, it does not form an attorney-client relationship between you and the law firm of Shakhan and Wilkerson, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship between yourself and me as your counsel or attorney. Okay. All right. We have another exciting video for those guys that are contemplating divorce or going through divorce. We frequently get questions regarding alimony or spousal support, either from both sides, really, whether they're same-sex relationships or whether they're involved men and women. There are always questions regarding alimony, and so it's an important topic, and we look forward to discussing it with you here over the next 20 minutes or so. Okay. All right, guys. So, what is alimony? Alimony goes by another name, spousal support, as well as spousal maintenance. And the purpose of it is really to support one spouse financially following a separation or a divorce. And it's only when appropriate. All right. So, every divorce does not merit alimony or spousal support. And we'll jump into that here in a bit. All right. So it is not automatic. I just kind of addressed that. And what I mean by that is one spouse does have to request it at the outset of the proceedings. Okay. And the judge, who has a wide ranging discretion, makes a determination whether or not that party has really made a case, an argument for alimony or spousal support. So just bear in mind that it's not going to be, in every divorce, there's no guarantee that you'll receive alimony or be awarded spousal support. Now, let's talk about the varying kinds of alimony because there are a few different types, okay? And so you'll hear about temporary alimony, and it's self-explanatory, right? It's just awarded can be awarded while a divorce is actually pending. Okay. So, as divorce proceedings are actually going on, there can be some form of spousal support that is not unusual, especially again, if there are great disparities. When it comes to the income, all right. So basically, it's just to that it's the purpose is to really just help maintain status quo during the pendency of the divorce, maybe before the division of assets and everyone gets set up. Okay, and so it's just to make certain that one party is not, financially in financial, well, I should say in financial straits during the pendency of the divorce. Okay, all right. So the other is a permanent alimony, award of alimony. Okay. And this is pretty unusual. We do not see a lot of this here in the state of Georgia. And that is basically when, following a divorce, it will be usually in a long term divorce. So you might be talking about someone who's been married decades, for example. There is a permanent award of alimony. Okay. And this can be, set for a specific period or just indefinitely, and so that usually you would say indefinitely if it is going to be a permanent award. And again, that is pretty atypical. In fact, I can't say that in my practice that I've ever actually seen a permanent award. Okay, though we do handle gray divorces and folks who have been married for some time. I just have not come across any in our practice. All right. Lump sum alimony. All right. So this is where one party is receiving essentially a big pile of assets or money at one point in time. And it can be cash and it can be property. All right. So just really depends, or it can be assets. It just really depends. And then lastly is just kind of a rehabilitative alimony, and it's really just for one spouse that perhaps has been maybe out of the workforce. This is just an example. It might allow for education or training, or some kind of support, so that they can be essentially self-sufficient, right? And so that again might be period based. There might be a time frame on that, and so that really just depends again on the judge, right, and on the facts of the case. And so, since we're talking about judges, let's talk a little bit about how they decide whether to award alimony. There is no formula, but here are some factors that generally counsel is factors that we argue when we are representing clients and we are seeking spousal support. One of the big ones is going to be the length of the marriage. So if we're looking at a marriage that the parties been married for 10 plus years, we feel like that's a good baseline for there to be some type of an alimony award. Of course, the second factor that's going to be considered is going to be income, right? So if there are income disparities, and then again, you're talking about a long-term marriage, sometimes in these kinds of cases, these types of cases, we're representing a party that might be a homemaker, right? And so someone, their spouse, went off to work. Maybe they were self-employed, and they were the breadwinner. Okay, so they may have handled all the finances, and our client was a homemaker, raised the children, essentially maintained the home, and just everyone was happy and go lucky, as long as both parties were kind of doing what they do until there was a divorce, right? Sometimes the parties will become empty nesters, and the kids are gone, and you're back to square one, where it's just you two in the house, and sometimes uh, things just don't work out. And in those situations, that homemaker, if there's a divorce proceedings going forward, that homemaker may be seeking spousal support, right? Because again, they are not the breadwinner; their spouse was the breadwinner, and they just have to find a way again to somehow maintain themselves financially during the pendency of their case until the end, the conclusion of their case, where the assets are going to be divided up and they can get access to resources so that they can live. So income is going to be considered, also your earning capacity, and so this is going to again impact someone who may not have had the educational background. They may not, their income capacity might be a little lower than their spouses. So all of that's going to be argued and taken into consideration by a judge. Access to financial resources, contributions to the marriage. So again, it's not that a homemaker, and I'm just using the example of a homemaker has made significant contributions to the marriage, right? Just because their spouse is away and they are working, they are funding their retirement, they are bringing money into the house. It does not uh, erase the work that the stay-at-home parent, if they're a parent, stay-at-home parent has done, right? Maybe they have been homeschooling the children for the past couple of decades, preparing all the meals, making certain that the house is clean, all right, sitting with the children, doing all the homework, doing all the pickups and the drop-offs, making lunch for their spouse to leave the house with, when they go off to work, right? Maybe they are the ones doing all the planning. Maybe they're the ones that are washing all the clothes, right? So as you can see, there's a lot of labor involved with it. Anyone who is the parent knows for a fact there's a lot of labor involved in rearing children, but there's a lot of labor involved in keeping a home as well. And so what we don't want to do is we don't want to measure one person's contributions against the other. And so that is something that the judge and the court will take into consideration. And then also they'll take in consideration the age of the party. So, one party could be older than the other. They both might be advanced in years. And so that's something that might also be a contributing factor. Resources. And then, child care responsibilities also, right? So maybe the children are not in the age of majority yet. Maybe the children are still minors. Okay. And so they are still going to need to be cared for. And all of that, again, might factor into a judge's decision. And then the time that's going to be needed for education, as well as perhaps job training. That's going to be important as well, because one person, maybe they were one spouse used to be in the private sector, gave up their profession to be a stay-at-home parent, and then they need to, of course, get back out into the private sector following a divorce because, obviously they need to earn an income. And so one of the things that a court's going to have to consider maybe is going to be, education and training, so that that spouse that was out of the private sector can re-enter into the private sector. And so that might be a contributing factor when thinking about alimony, spousal support, and spousal maintenance. Okay. All right. So those are some things that courts do consider. But one thing also courts consider, at least here in Georgia, right? So Georgia is a little unique when it comes to marital misconduct. Okay. And so in Georgia, and we're one of the few states where, if you are at fault, right, for the demise of the relationship, you're committing acts of infidelity or desertion, that might impact whether or not you will receive spousal support or alimony. Remember, the judges have wide discretion in these matters when it comes to this stuff, right? Some other kind of conduct has led to, again, the destruction and demise of the relationship. Then that might actually bar you from an award of spousal support. So that's something that you would need to talk with your attorney about, because, as I said, sometimes the facts are different in each case, and they can give you a little bit more advice on whether or not you have a very strong case to fight alimony and alimony request an award if that's what the other side is seeking, or to actually request one. All right. And so let's talk about how much alimony might be, right? What you might be, looking to expect in terms of an award. And not to surprise you, but there is no real formula here in Georgia for coming up with alimony. It's not like child support. There is no calculator or a fixed percentage. Judges have a lot of discretion in an alimony or spousal support award. Okay. And so it's just going to differ in each case. And so you may have a friend that was awarded alimony, and again, maybe they got a lump sum. You may have another friend who, had alimony for a specific period of time. I've seen, 3 years, I've seen 10 years, right? I've seen everything in between. Okay. And so just really depends on the judge, depends on the case, depends on the facts. Every case is different. That's a little challenging for folks to hear because people believe, that the justice system is fairly cookie cutter, and it's just not. A lot of times these facts are very, very different. And of course, the judge that's listening to the facts is going to be different usually as well. Okay. And so, in terms of how long alimony lasts, we talked a little bit about that, I think, briefly. And some of it is going to depend on what the judge orders, right? And so there will be a court order, but there also could be a settlement agreement. The parties can come to an agreement amongst themselves about how long alimony is going to last for. And that's going to be up to the parties. But, again, a lot of the things you should take into consideration are the length of the marriage and, of course, the financial circumstances. But, whatever the party contracts for, that is going to be essentially between the parties. But you do got to be very, very careful about, contracting and putting certain terms and conditions in that those settlement agreements when it comes to an alimony award. That's one of the reasons why super important to have an attorney, especially if you're talking about spousal support. Okay. Basically, to that point, alimony could last a few months, it could last a few years, it could last a few decades, right? And so, I've kind of just told you the judges have wide discretion. But as I mentioned earlier on in the video, just be mindful that, at least in the state of Georgia, there are very few permanent alimony awards. Okay, just very, very few. All right. Now, can alimony be modified? Sometimes, okay. I can't tell you how many calls this and guys, you got to be smarter, okay. I just fielded a call today. Someone had a TPO. It did not go their way, so they're calling attorneys' offices and they're trying to get it appealed. And and we see the same thing with divorce. Someone has represented themselves pro se all the way through the divorce. They got to the end. They got absolutely hammered. And then the next day they're looking to get an attorney to either appeal the case or to file some kind of motion for a new trial or a motion for reconsideration. And you got to get an attorney at the outset. All right. So as soon as you don't go into this represent, if the stakes are high, it just doesn't, it's not worth it, guys. It's if the stakes are high, because in the end you're going to end up paying more in like spousal support or alimony than you would have paid the attorney. Okay. And so even if you have to pay a spousal support, an award of spousal support, there are arguments to be made that it should be at a certain number. Okay. Because sometimes in these types of cases where there's an award of spousal support or alimony, there's also an award of child support. There might also be an award of attorney's fees, right? So you can be getting hammered, right, by costs and fees. And so it makes more sense, people are trying to save, a few $100s or a few $1,000s, and you end up, putting out tens of thousands of dollars. We've been in cases where we've gotten clients hundreds of thousands of dollars in these divorces. These divorces are high stakes. I don't know how else to say it. If I spoke another language, I would say it in a different language. But you're talking about retirement assets. Some retirements are worth millions of dollars, right? You're talking about your home. Homes are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, okay? And so, and then you're talking about kicking out things like alimony and spousal support. And so if you have these assets, you have a complex case. You should think very strong. And this is before you get to anything, people who have minor children, you have a complex case. You should think very long and hard about representing yourself in court. Okay. Because it's, you can do it, but I see people get into courts and it's them versus their spouse and their spouse's attorney, and it just doesn't go their way a lot of times. Okay. And so it's just something to think about. But and I'm sorry for that. That was tangential there. I went off a bit, but I had, just again flashback of some of these consultations that I sit on a daily basis, and we get calls from guys like the day after they get the final divorce decree. They want to appeal, and it's like, well, one of my first questions is, well, did you have an attorney, representing? Oh no, I didn't have an attorney. I went forward without an attorney. But now, guess what? Now you're willing to pay for an attorney because you're trying to undo what was done. And let's just say hypothetically you're successful, you're going to pay essentially double because now you have to pay someone to undo what was done and then go back through the process again, right? And so you end up paying twice for what you could have just paid for once. Okay. So I would just say be smart, and you also have to do a cost benefit analysis. Maybe you don't have a lot of assets, right? Maybe you're not worried about spousal support. But if all of those things are on the table, and they usually are, right? They usually are from the calls that we get in the consultations, they usually are, then you should strongly think about, retaining counsel. All right. So that's my little plug. You can think about it. But at the end of the day, they're your assets, it's your case, and you have to make that final decision of that determination. All right. So I'm saying that because one of the questions we get all the time is, "Hey, I was my spouse was awarded alimony. Can it be modified?" And the answer is sometimes, right? Very challenging to do, and a lot to prove, and it can be costly, pretty expensive, right? And so, it can be possible if there's been some kind of substantial change. like job loss or retirement or some kind of a disability, and there's going to be a significant increase or decrease in income. However, a lot of these agreements, Ned talked a little bit about that earlier. The agreements that are entered into are non-modifiable. Okay, and so they put those kind of terms and conditions in those agreements on purpose, right? Meaning that the agreement cannot be modified, all right? And so, I mean, you might, some stuff might sound in contracts, something might be unconscionable, you know, uh, that would be, you would have to sit with an attorney, and usually that's not something that you would do in a consultation. That's something you would either do in the case evaluation, or you have an attorney under retainer, and they would go through that contract with you and see what can be done, right? So sometimes not much can be done. So when alimony might end, again, in depending on the case, it could end in death of one of the parties, or it can end in remarriage of one of the parties. It really depends. Depends again if it's an agreement, settlement agreement, which you guys might have contracted for, about when it can terminate. All right. And so let's talk about some common misconceptions really quickly regarding spousal support alimony. One of them is that the wife always gets alimony, and that's just not true. Either spouse can actually earn alimony. Okay. Another is that long marriages or receive permanent alimony. One spouse might receive permanent alimony if they have been a party to a long marriage, and that's just not necessarily the case. Sometimes it is the case, and sometimes it's not the case. Right. A higher income. So if one party has a higher income than the other party, maybe alimony might be awarded. Maybe alimony or spousal support may not be awarded. Okay, it just really again considers not just this is need based, but is also the other party's ability to pay. So remember those two things. Yes, need based. Yes, but the other party's ability to pay, right? So, there might be a demonstrated need, but if this party cannot pay it, then there may not be an alimony award or spousal support award, okay? So, some common mistakes are that folks are just going to assume that alimony is guaranteed when it's just not. Of course, when you're factoring in spousal support, this is another reason you might want to get an attorney involved. One party might be hiding assets, right? Hopefully, you've seen some of our other videos where we're discussing hidden assets, but that's going to impact what that final payout might look like, and what even some type of an alimony or a spousal support payment might look like a lump sum. And so all of those things are contributing factors. One party, if you quit your job, does that mean you don't have to pay, or you're underemployed? Does that not mean you have to pay alimony? That's just not the case, all right? And that's something that sometimes a counsel will point out. For example, if you have your doctorate degree, but you're working down at the Greyhound bus station, okay, that might be brought up in court, and one of the attorneys might have take issue with that, and the judge may take issue with that. Okay. And then of course you agreeing one common mistake is agreeing to paying alimony without understanding the long-term consequences. All right, so as I wrap up, again, here are some times when you should strongly think about retaining an attorney. If you are in a long-term marriage and you're getting a divorce, and you're talking about a lot of potential assets or alimony, you should think very strongly and very long about retaining an attorney. You need one. If one spouse has been a stay-at-home parent and raised children, you should think about retaining an attorney. If there are significant income differences, an attorney. All right. Business ownership. If one party owns a business, or the family owns a business, you might need an attorney. All right. High value assets. We represent a few clients who are millionaires and have a lot of assets. You might want to think about getting an attorney. Again, retirement accounts. These retirement accounts can be worth millions of dollars, as I mentioned. You may want to get an attorney. Request for a permanent alimony. If that's going to be, your position, you are seeking permanent alimony or long-term alimony. You any form of alimony you might want to get. an attorney. All right. So these are the situations where that warrant calling a law firm, bringing somebody on, and retaining an attorney. This video specifically, as I said, is about spousal support and alimony. Hopefully, it's been helpful. If it has, please give us a like. And if you know someone going through a divorce and they should be thinking about alimony or spousal support, you should go ahead and send this over to them, like and share, and give us a follow. We talk a lot about not only family law and divorce, child custody, and men's rights, but we also talk about criminal law, okay, criminal defense. And we'd be happy to help you if you have a criminal issue, if you have a divorce issue. You can give us a call at 478-845-1213, or you can give us a call at 404-999-9529, and we will be happy to represent you. Just give us a call. We have a consultation with you. We'll see if maybe we can come to some terms and agreement. And if so, then we'd be happy to assist you, hopefully meet your legal goals. Okay. All right, guys. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on the next video.